Welcome, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and get our event started. Can I just have a show of hands of how many new people are here today? Oh, that's terrific. Terrific. Well, you're welcome to join us in the future as well, but we're glad you came and are going to be a part of our organization. If you haven't already, give us your email. We'll keep you connected as to our future events. We're really excited to increase our number, and it's always good to see new people. We have a great event planned for today, and I hope you enjoy this. This is one I'm really looking forward to because of the area that I think we are concerned about is that Israel side of all things is being presented properly. And that's probably, if you're like me, probably feel like sometimes it's not. So this will be really interesting to hear about today. I'm going to ask Karen Mika Ali to come up here and introduce our speaker. And then we'll allow him to talk, and there'll be a time for question and answer. And that'll be it for the program today. Karen?
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? So I'm very honored today to introduce our speaker, but I just want to briefly talk about Iowans Supporting Israel, and I have a request. So in this moment where the demonization of Israel is not actually about Israel, we are waking up to that fact, and anti-Zionism is legitimately I would say, a bona fide hate movement, and that has a real world impact on Jewish communities around the world. We're doing our small part here in Iowa to provide education and give and try to counter this toxic messaging that's out there. And we hope that we bring value in that way. And if you find these lunch and learns valuable, then please support us so that we can continue to have them. And if you would like to know how to donate, please see Tamara Harrison just outside the door. So with that, I'd like to introduce Kevin Deutsch. Kevin is an award-winning Jewish news journalist, digital creator, and author of the Watchdog Jewish News Substack. After October 7th is the name of it. I encourage you all to subscribe. He covers general assignment news in Jewish communities for Talk Media, an award-winning chain of local news sites in South Florida. He also writes about Jewish issues for the Kansas City Jewish Chronicle and St. Louis Jewish Light. Kevin previously worked as a senior staff writer at the Miami Times, which is a historic Black newspaper in Miami, Florida. He's also worked as a staff writer at the Rio Grande SUN, the New York Daily News, the Miami Herald, the Palm Beach Post, and the Riverdale Press. Kevin has received numerous awards for his journalism, including the 2024 Florida Press Club Awards for Best Minority News Coverage and Best General News Coverage. Alarmed by the distorted news coverage, which Tom alluded to, of Israel and the Middle East in mainstream media after October 7th, he began writing about anti-Zionism in media and speaking out about how weaponized anti-Zionist narratives make their way into mainstream coverage, which we've all seen. He frequently writes about how those narratives impact Jewish safety across America, and he joins us today to share some of what he's learned. So welcome, Kevin Deutsch.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Tamara. And thank you, all of you, for coming out today, both in person and watching on Zoom. It's a real honor to be able to address your group at this crucial time for the Jewish people. I don't know if you guys have heard yet. Also, can you guys hear me okay, or is there an echo?
Yeah, we're good. Fine.
Good? Okay. So I don't know if you heard today, but Barry Weiss, the head of CBS News, was scheduled to give the Daniel Pearl lecture at UCLA, and anti-Zionist, racist pressured um, the hosting organization into canceling her lecture. She was going to give a lecture on the future of journalism, and because she's a Zionist and because she's Jewish, and for other reasons that you're probably aware of, she was canceled. So I appreciate you guys not canceling me. It's important that we have these conversations, and we're going to be talking a little bit about uh, uh, anti-Zionism in news media, how anti-Israel bias came to dominate mainstream media, and what it means for the safety of American Jews. And if at any point I cut out or anything, please just let me know. So, I think we're really in a first world war of information. It's an unprecedented battle in which Israel and Jews are the target, and Islamists, including Iran, Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, Qatar, and their anti-Zionist allies, such as Russia, China, are allied against Israel and Jews and the U.S. with the goal of othering Zionists, othering Jews, purging Jews from social spaces, particularly influential social spaces like Weiss's position, for example, uh, and ultimately destroying Israel. Because if you destroy Zionism and people who support Israel, then you can destroy Israel. And then Islamist theology, ideology can become the dominant ideology globally. So these trends that we're seeing in news media don't just harm Jews and Israelis, they empower Hamas, ISIS, Hezbollah, Iran, and they encourage the persecution of minority groups across the Mideast. When you start to silence people like Barry Weiss, or uh, silence Jews and Zionists, and frame Israel as a Jewish supremacist oppressor, while Qatar's billions quietly shape American education, politics, media, and actual global threats are ignored by the mainstream press, while Israel and Zionists are habitually libeled and demonized through obsessive coverage. You have a real problem for the Jewish people. And so the stakes are very high in this media narrative war on Israel and Jews. And really, I don't want to overstate it, but the outcome of this war will really determine whether or not this media narrative war will determine whether Israel is seen as having saved the world from an Iranian nuclear bomb and from the threat of Islamist terror, or whether or not terrorist ideology will succeed in Islamist ideology will essentially succeed in prevailing across the globe. And so the stakes really couldn't be higher. So I'm going to talk a little bit about all of these things, and I want to start with Hamas. Uh, After October 7th, Hamas framed their war on Israel, which we all know what happened on October 7th. It was the deadliest day, deadliest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. Hamas framed that as part of you had the fighting war, the kinetic war, and then they also talked about a narrative war, which was a strategic, ideological, media-driven extension of their war on Israel. And their strategy for that war after October 7th has focused on recontextualizing the attack as resistance, as legitimate resistance, rather than terrorism and war crimes, while actively working to shape international opinion, particularly among younger generations, against Israel and against Zionists. And their main vehicle for this has been the news media. It's really been an unprecedented weaponization of narratives. As the anti-Zionist hate movement grew, the media helped, right? The media began to launder their propaganda And it became normal for it to be delivered to us, the news consumers, as legitimate news, even though it was terrorist Hamas propaganda. And really, it's not just Hamas, of course. It's all those groups it's all those anti-American countries and groups I described. It's also the Muslim Brotherhood, which has its tentacles in state news media and Muslim Brotherhood news media throughout the Arab world and throughout totalitarian Islamist regimes. And of course, Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the aim of this global information war, which was, of course, underway before October 7th, October 7th just brought it to the formal declaration of war, right? Kind of like World War I and World War II, we saw there were things going on well before that that were laying the groundwork. And then when Hitler invaded Poland, it was the real war. And then France and England declare war. Then you have the real war. It's kind of like that. So the real war in earnest began October 7th. And the goal of that war that we're in right now is to the narrative war fought through the news media is to erase Jewish history, replace or usurp Jews as the true indigenous inhabitants of Israel, to encourage and fuel anti-Zionism and the purging of Jews from public spaces, and through that mechanism, ultimately destroy Israel as a Jewish state. So the predominant problem, I think, is activist journalism, and that the anti-Zionist framework for seeing the world has now permeated mainstream media. And it's not just stories about Israel. It's stories about Jews in the United States. I'm going to focus on the United States. And so you'll see what, in terms of the bias against Israel in the news media, you've since October 7th also seen that same bias when news outlets cover the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, right? What do you always see in the headline? Free speech concerns. IHR bill proposed as opponents voice concern over free speech, freedom of speech. And so it's never described as, we're just trying to stop bigoted speech against Jews by comparing us to Nazis and comparing Israel to and saying Israel is an inherently genocidal project. These are all things that dehumanize and mark Jews for violence. And that's what we're trying to stop with IHRA, and yet the news media launders it into a free speech story. The speech that they want to protect being Jewish bigotry, right? And then you have AIPAC, the AIPAC libel. AIPAC is a foreign entity; it's evil. That's laundered through the news media so that it looks like legitimate concern. Synagogue protests, people outside synagogues terrorizing Jews. That's framed as, well, they were having they were talking about sale of land inside, and so that must be a legitimate protest. These are all narratives that are laundered by the mainstream news media, and the aim is of the anti-Zionist movement, which uses the news media, is to criminalize and suppress Jewish life, which has happened in every totalitarian, anti-democratic system. It happens in every Islamist country. It's happened in every country that turned against its Jews. So our goal is to stop it from happening here, of course. Now, the key mechanism of this media war on Israel is anti-Jewish information laundering, right? Same way we have money laundering, where the mob, a criminal organization, will make a bunch of money off drugs and prostitution, and then they send it to their front business, and they clean the money through the cash register there, through cooking the books. That's the same way that Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, Qatar, and their allies use NGOs, right, non-governmental organizations, and think tanks and so-called progressive organizations that are anti-Israel to launder their libels against anti-Israel libels through the news media, which is very sympathetic to those libels. And we're going to talk about why. So we all know that this has a direct impact on Jewish safety, right? And we've seen that ever since Israel was founded. Modern Israel was founded in 1948. We've seen every time there's a flare up in Gaza in our lifetimes of violence, there's anti-Semitism in the West. And when October 7th happened, and we fought a 2-year plus war, you saw that something well beyond those flare-ups of anti-Semitism, and it's still with us today because it was such a prolonged opportunity for this media war. And so since October 7th, the anti-Israel bias has really spilled into domestic coverage of Jewish communities. Anti-Zionist protests that turn violent in the United States and throughout the West are labeled clashes, right? I saw a lot of coverage of the anti-Zionist bigots outside Parkey Synagogue in Manhattan earlier this year. And a lot of news outlets framed it as clashes because they were pro-Israel people who showed up. And so it became not an anti-Semitic hate mob. And I use the word anti-Zionist bigot or anti-Zionist racist because I treat it as a hate movement, as does the movement against anti-Zionism and other groups that are fighting the anti-Zionist hate movement. But these bigots were whitewashed through the news media as having been involved in clashes with pro-Israel protesters instead of reporters telling the truth. So the perpetrators' actions when they take action against Israel and Zionists are often softened or explained away by legacy media. You also see a lot of anti-Semitic tropes find their way into mainstream news coverage, or now anti-Zionist tropes. You saw that in the Amsterdam pogrom, which was, I think that was more than a year ago now, where Israelis were attacked, beaten in the streets, and then essentially victim blamed for being provocative against the opposing group's team soccer fans. So that's why you could beat them up for being Israelis, according to the news media. You see harassment of Jews, whitewashed at schools, universities, Jewish events. The same pattern repeats in the news media, where it is both sides. So I've seen it firsthand as a journalist covering Jewish communities and the anti-Zionist hate movement. The media bias and gaslighting are endemic. So let's talk a little bit about October 7th. We know it was a terrorist attack, the deadliest since the Holocaust. Civilians were deliberately targeted. We know that rape was used systemically as a weapon of war. The 251 hostages were taken. And we know that a number of journalists, Gazan journalists, were embedded with Hamas during the attack and delivered the first pictures of the attack and first reports of the attack to mainstream Western news outlets. And that's what the first images you saw were those. And then, of course, Hamas uploaded their GoPro footage of their massacre online, and that was briefly used by news media. And it's important to note that Sinwar, the now deceased leader of Hamas on the ground militarily in Gaza, had said that we're going to get the journalists to work for us. When he was plotting October 7th with Iran and Hezbollah, he said, we're going to get the Western journalists to work for us. And that's essentially what he did. And so after about, I would say, 10 days of news coverage that accurately reflected what had happened on October 7th and accurately reflected the history, to some degree, of Israel and the Middle East, you then saw the center of gravity shift very subtly. And when Israel responded, you saw the story become Israeli airstrikes, casualty tolls supplied by Hamas, of course, humanitarian concerns, warnings about food, humanitarian supplies, warnings about civilian casualties, whether Israel was being careful enough in its targeting of Hamas. And of course, the October 7th very quickly faded, and Israel's response came under a magnifying glass and became the obsessive focus of basically every mainstream news outlet across America and the West. So a key problem lies in how information from Gaza comes out, right? There is no free press in Gaza, journalists work under Hamas control. That holds true whether you're a Gazan, Palestinian, or you're a Western journalist there. You have to check in with Hamas. They control your movements. They say what you can and can't shoot. After you take photographs or write something, they are going to look at it. And if they don't get to look at it and it ends up upsetting them, well, you're out, you're done. And this is one of the most prestigious assignments for Western journalists. So they're going to want they generally do follow Hamas's orders or they're done. So much of what reaches the outside world, and this predates October 7th, pretty much for the last 15, 20 years, comes from the terror group itself or is censored by Hamas. Now, we know the journalists who were embedded with Hamas during their invasion and the atrocities, but all journalists in Gaza were surveilled by Hamas and kept in close physical proximity to Hamas operatives who influenced their coverage. 4 Palestinian reporters resisting this arrangement can and has led to blackmail, imprisonment, torture, and for foreign correspondents, honest reporting can lead to threats, loss of access, blacklisting from ever reporting on the group again, getting an interview with them again, or getting their information again. So journalists doing Hamas's bidding in Gaza after October 7th worked as stringers and still do for some of the world's largest newspapers and wire services. That includes the Associated Press. That includes Reuters. The Reuters Middle East Bureau is based in Qatar. So all the Middle East coverage is routed through Qatar, which is basically the global leader in anti-Zionist propaganda. And so we know Al Jazeera, right? And so Al Jazeera is considered, which is state media, is state anti-Zionist media, is considered a legitimate news source by many Western news organizations, including American news organizations. And so you see, Reuters has the center of their Middle East bureau is in Qatar. So you can only imagine, what's going on there, how stories are being whitewashed. So stories are slanted against Israel, starting with these Gaza stringers, Palestinians who are under the control and influence of Hamas, and sometimes actually members or affiliates of Hamas. And those are then those reports and photographs are then published by news outlets across the world, literally hundreds, sometimes thousands. And Hamas's claims in these articles, including casualty totals, are treated as credible, while Israeli statements are downplayed, met with skepticism. And once the Hamas narrative is whitewashed through mainstream media, it's echoed and it's amplified across global media, across social media. And those narratives then shape public opinion against Israel far well in advance before facts can be properly examined. And corrections, when they appear at all, which is rare, never undo the initial damage because most readers don't see those scratchings, and that's intentional because they're buried by the news outlets. So this breakdown of neutrality, this breakdown in resisting Islamist ideology in Western press reflects deeper changes inside American media. Many are now staffed by reporters and editors who are politically left-leaning, which is fine, except unfortunately, as part of that, they view Israel through a lens of power, oppression, oppression dynamics, and distrust, which leads them to buy into the genocide, apartheid, colonizer lives. So Israel is not just questioned in most of these newsrooms; it's presumed guilty after any incident. And neutrality is often treated as naive or suspect by many of these journalists, and information, witness accounts, reportedly, photographs unfavorable toward Israel are fast-tracked for publication without traditional fact-checking. And that's because anti-Israel bias in newsrooms is quietly shaping story selection, framing, language, headlines, story placement, front page or inside, while stories more favorable to Israel go inside or are buried. So just a few examples: the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times. These are some of the largest newspapers in America. Associated Press, the largest wire service, all sympathetic to the anti-Zionist cause. Uh, October 7th very quickly became a story of Israeli excess and cruelty in mainstream press. And what became increasingly clear was that we were in a fight for our lives as Jews, and that for the Jewish future, I should say. And it was going to be a fight that determines whether or not barbarism is going to win out or civilization in the West. So it's a real test for the West, and that's where we find ourselves. So let's talk a little bit about. I want to talk about Maddie Friedman. He was an AP reporter, Jewish AP reporter, has spoken very bravely and boldly about Middle Eastern coverage, Israel coverage at the AP. And he has spoken about how in reality, there are 2 billion Muslims in the world who essentially, most of them want to destroy the 7 million Jews in Israel and destroy Israel. It's been the case since the 1930s, certainly since 1948. And the AP, he has said, reframe that to become a conflict, not between the 2 billion Muslims who want to annihilate Israel, but between the 7 million Jews in Israel who want to annihilate 2 million Palestinian Arabs, right? So it became not that the narrative that the Arab world wants to destroy Israel, which they most certainly do, but that Israel wants to destroy Palestinians. So you took a macro conflict and made it a micro conflict to make Israel look like the villain. And the powerful occupying force, the white colonizer, and Palestinians become the oppressed, helpless, trapped population. So he's talked about the AP presuming Israel guilty and becoming almost the exclusive focus of Middle Eastern coverage. It's framed as militaristic, unsparing in its brutality, and Palestinians are viewed as innocent in AP coverage, right? And Hamas ideology, genocidal, terroristic, brutal, is minimized whenever possible and reframed as freedom fighting or resistance. So this lens that Maddie Friedman at the AP, when he was at the AP, is now describing influences coverage at every news outlet, because AP is the big dog. Anything that AP does, other newspapers want to follow. So that influences our safety as Jews all around the world and in the United States, because when a story, an anti-Israel story, goes viral and everyone's reading it, we've seen it. Jewish targets get attacked. Jews get attacked. There's a direct correlation. And what people believe about the Israel-Arab conflict is largely false, I would argue. So you have Maddie Friedman talking about reporting from Gaza being controlled. His prime example was that he was writing a story one day for the AP, and this is well before October 7th, and Hamas told the AP that they wanted them to remove a detail from a story about the fact that Hamas was fighting Israeli troops in Gaza while dressed in civilian garb. So the Hamas terrorists were dressed as civilians, and the AP reporter put that in the story, and Hamas got upset and told their AP contact, "You got to take that out of the story, or you're cut off." Guess what happened? Maddie Friedman was ordered to take it out of the story. So that's a real world example of what we're dealing with here: totalitarian control of the press, without journalistic organizations telling us that there's totalitarian control of the press in Gaza and throughout the Muslim world. So, and of course, then we have the casualty totals, which we know to be a suspect. We don't know how suspect, but we know that media runs with them almost immediately, whereas anything that Israel says is treated with suspicion and suspect. And this all shapes the coverage of Zionism, of Israel, and unfortunately, it's extended to coverage of Jewish communities. So let's talk about 2020. I think 2020 is a key point, and when we looked at how the media changed against Israel, that's when after George Floyd was killed by the police officer in Minnesota, choked to death. The, after he was killed, um, we start to see this oppressor oppressed narrative, which the progressive politics ran with, in which the news media felt emboldened to give up their neutrality and to take up an activist frame. And this led to activist journalism beginning to really dominate mainstream US media and Western media. And in that framing, you often see people who are white, right, or considered white, like Jews are being portrayed as the hyper white colonizer, which is ridiculous, right? Because the Nazis said we weren't white and we were race polluters. But to the anti-Zionist movement, we're hyper white. And that's been sort of picked up by the media, even though they won't say that. And that the Palestinians are people of color, right? And so you have the whites oppressing people of color. That really took off in 2020. And you see that manifesting today in anti-Israel coverage and anti-Jewish coverage in mainstream press. So the media today is really leading us to conclusions about Israel. Rather than fighting a defensive legal war, they want lead us to a conclusion that it's a genocidal illegal war, right? By misstating facts about international law, by whitewashing the anti-Zionism of NGOs and the UN. And so at the same time you have the anti-Zionist hate movement spreading these libels, you have the media narrative supporting that. So I want to talk briefly about, I want to show you a couple things here, if I can figure this out. Okay, well, it looks like I can't share this, so I'm just going to talk. I'm just going to keep talking. But there are a series of libels that the anti-Zionist movement that have been essentially laundered by mainstream media. And the main ones are colonizer, right? That Jews are intruders in our ancestral homeland. That we have enacted a system of apartheid in Israel. Of course, both of these are completely ridiculous, and that Israel is a genocidal project, and you're seeing that quote ongoing genocide today. These are the talking points of the anti-Zionist hate movement, and they have begun. They have been accepted to some degree by the mainstream news media because they're reflected in their coverage, which of course shapes local perception, not just of Israel, but of Jews. And of course, we know this is totally false. And there's something called accusation in a mirror. It's a social academic concept which posits that when a political actor wants to other or destroy a group, their opponent, they accuse them of what they themselves intend to do to that group or opponent. A good example is Nazi Germany. They accused Jews of being the evil, genocidal. They were going to destroy the master race. And so, of course, we know that it was actually the Nazis who were going to destroy Jews. So accuse your opponent. Accusation in a mirror. That describes to a T the libels that the anti-Zionist movement spreads about Israel and Zionists, and which have since permeated coverage that impacts the Jewish world, that stigmatizes us, marks us for violence, aims to turn us into social pariahs, BDS, universities, purge us from social spaces like this Barry Weiss, even the most influential of us. They view that as a huge win when we're silenced, because it's a totalizing, totalitarian ideology. So these stories that the media tells us shape our culture. Our culture is shaped by storytelling and the stories that people hear. And these anti-Jewish narratives are becoming very predominant, I would say, with conspiracies that are pushed by being pushed by sort of the NGOs, by propaganda actors, by Al Jazeera, by the Muslim Brotherhood, by the UN. These are picked up by the activist press. They make their way into the mainstream press. So it's not just colonizer, genocide, apartheid. It's also the child killer libels, right? How many times have we seen pictures of Palestinian children on the covers of newspapers? It's, and it came, and it's framed as though Israel is purposely killing children, right? This is the child killer libel. It's ancient. It's the original blood libel in medieval Europe. And then you see the medicide libel that were killing doctors, that were destroying hospitals, right? This is the medicide libel. So you've got baby killer libel, child killer libels, all picked up by mainstream press when they plaster pictures of desperate Palestinian children on their front pages and ignore any sense of neutrality. How did maybe was it the fact that Hamas embeds itself in civilian buildings and populations and hospitals? So this is what they ignore, and they run with the libels, and the Israeli response is buried in the news story. So this has been, there's so many libels. And there's also, so I want to talk about some of those, the hospital bomber libel, right? And we're finding out that these are all untrue, because it's now coming out that Hamas, even Doctors Without Borders, pulled out of Gaza last week because they admitted that Hamas was operating out of hospitals, that there were tunnels. You will never read about tunnels, the vast terror tunnel network under Gaza, in the mainstream press, or see it in mainstream on TV news, even though the entire environment of Gaza has been weaponized to commit mass martyrdom, that the Palestinians should commit mass martyrdom to make Israel look like murderers. This is the truth, that Hamas weaponized Gaza with a tunnel network that is larger than the London Underground, that they operated intentionally out of civilian homes, hospitals, schools, UN centers, and that this was all weaponized so that Hamas would fight out of these places in civilian clothing and maximize civilian death in an act of mass martyrdom. You would think that would be at the top of every story to explain why civilians ended up dead, right? If they did in an attack. But of course it's not. You never read about that. And that's really because the Hamas narrative has been whitewashed and picked up by mainstream media, which is largely sympathetic to the anti-Zionist narrative. At least that was my experience in mainstream newsrooms. And I think it's clearly the case today. And this narrative has direct impact not just on us, but Israelis, because if the media had not been so biased and against Israel, it would have given Hamas reason to fight as long as they did. We could have gotten the hostages out sooner, right? So how does the media do this, right? They use language as a weapon of war, just like, and that's because they're picking up the language that the NGOs and Hamas and the Brotherhood and Al Jazeera and Qatar use, all these state outlets use. They use phrases like occupation, right? What is the occupation? Are we talking about the West Bank? Are we talking about Gaza? Are they talking about what Hamas says, which is that all of Israel is occupied? So it's an amorphous phrase that the press often uses when quoting Hamas or Palestinians or Arab leaders, and it's purposely amorphous, and it's meant for us not to know what's going on, so that Israel is just viewed as the evil occupier. What's a settler? You'll often see settler, the word settler used. What's a settler? Is it just someone who lives in Judea and Samaria? By the way, the name the West Bank didn't become popularized until 1950, when Jordan, which controlled which was occupying Judea and Samaria, started calling it the West Bank, to disconnect the Jewish connection to the land, the same way that Rome called their kingdoms of Judea and Israel Palestina, Syria, Palestina, right? And so these are the same, it's even Rome knew that this was going to be successful, right? And that this rebranding. And the Jordanians knew it in 1950. So now most of the world calls Judea and Samaria the West Bank, and Israelis who live there in regular houses and apartments, settlers. What's a settlement? Again, it's an opaque term weaponized by anti-Zionists and then by laundered by mainstream media. So you have mainstream media also crucially erasing October 7th, right? It's essentially disappeared from most coverage. Sometimes you'll see a line down in a story that says, uh, uh, an attack on Hamas attacked and killed some 1,200 people and took 251 hostages on October 7th, blah, 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 in the bottom of the story, right? It's a throwaway line. And so even though that's what precipitated the war, the media turns it into a story about the cycle of violence, that essentially October 7th was just the latest in a round of violence that is happening because the Jews have the gall to be in Israel, right? And so you don't read about human shields. You don't read about Hamas's strategy of mass martyrdom. You don't read about Hamas's genocidal charter or its Iranian backing or the tunnel networks or Hamas's repression of gays in Gaza, execution of opponents. This is all censored by our mainstream press. So, they use language like militants, fighters, instead of terrorists, right? You almost never read the word terrorist organization or Islamist terrorist in mainstream news coverage of Israel. And this is just, this is because we're dealing with an anti-Zionist news media. And Maddie Friedman talked a little bit about how we got there, right? And because a lot of these reporters come from universities where they were indoctrinated with the same beliefs that we're seeing people indoctrinated with today. Qatar has expended billions to instill these narratives in the minds of our young people in America. And part of that is journalism programs. And those elite journalism programs, the graduates of the programs go on to work at the Washington Post, New York Times, AP, LA Times. So this is not a coincidence. This is how the system works and how the plan is working very effectively to demonize Israel and Zionists and Jews. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the most egregious examples we only have a couple minutes here, so I want to talk about some of the most egregious examples. You really saw the turn away from the Israel was attacked on October 7th. It was a genocidal attack, monstrous, barbaric. There's never been an attack like this in modern history. But about 10 days later, on October 7th, in Gaza City, the Al-Ali hospital was hit. There was explosions. And the New York Times immediately reported 500 dead on its front page. Israel kills 500 hospital. Spread globally. There were protests in the streets, outrage. Jews were attacked globally. And this is the point where the narrative war, you start to see it really reflected in how Jews are living and how we're being impacted. Because it only took a couple weeks before we learned actually it wasn't an Israeli strike that damaged the hospital, that killed people. It was an Islamic Jihad rocket that misfired. And it wasn't 500 people dead like Hamas said. It was probably about 100, which is still terrible. But this is stuff that was on the front page of the New York Times. It was a blood libel on the front page of the New York Times. And the correction was like this, right? I mean, intended for us not to see it. So even though, then you have the Al-Shifa hospital strike. Okay, this was in November 2023. Israeli officials said that Al-Shifa was being used as a Hamas command center, that there were tunnel shafts, underground passageways, weapons storage. They had been looking for hostages there. But what did you see in the news? Israel commandos raiding a hospital, right? And the Hamas narrative that there was no tunnels, that this was a war crime. You had NGOs and UN saying this is a war crime. You had narratives weaponized against Israel. And yet we now know Doctors Without Borders last week acknowledged Israel was telling the truth. This was a Hamas weapons and battle center. But it's too late. People are already convinced. Good luck convincing them of the truth in that case. So this is an ideological war this global war on information. We're seeing it in all of these stories. You saw it in when the aid distribution was going on, right? Hamas would say that there were aid seekers being murdered by Israeli troops at aid sites. That's not true. I've interviewed the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation officials, and there were incidents outside of the sites because Hamas was basically encouraging people to create issues where they would be mistaken for Hamas fighters, in which and Israeli troops would open fire. But at actual aid sites, there were no fatalities, and so this is propaganda that was spread. Israel is killing aid seekers, right? Another blood libel, right? So then we had the starvation narrative, right? We know that now that there was no famine, that all these groups that said there was a famine and starvation changed their metrics to be able to change the definition of what a famine was, the same way that they've tried to change the definition of what a genocide is. And so these stories came out in the mainstream press. 14,000 babies are about to die from starvation. UN warns. You know how many babies died? 0 of starvation. So these were all blood libels. We saw the pictures of on the front page of the New York Times and newspapers across the world of emaciated Palestinian babies. These newspapers told us these babies were starving, but they actually had genetic conditions that made their appearance look so gaunt and emaciated. So what does this coverage do? It leads to the protest, anti-Zionist racist protest, anti-Zionist racism in politics, attacks on Jews, right? Of course, we have the ICJ, right, which uses all of this informational warfare content, South Africa's case against Israel in the ICJ, to try and frame Israelis as genocidal and a defensive war as genocide. And briefly, I want to touch on the sexual violence libel that Israel lied about the sexual violence. One of the most disgusting libels I've seen that the media has essentially ran with in many cases or suppressed, right? Scores of Jewish women and some men raped, often publicly, often gang raped. And this story has largely been suppressed, except for here and there. So what can we do? Briefly, as readers, as news consumers, what should you do? You should, when you see a story that falsely describes genocide or famine or misstates what Hamas is or is unfair to Israel, or you see something that makes you know what it is when you see it, right? Contact the editors, right? Quote specific sentences, request clarifications, request corrections. Be precise, be calm, do it in email. And if that doesn't get action, you can call, right? Believe me, I fielded a lot of calls in newspapers. People are always calling up to complain. You can do it too, because the anti-Zionists are doing it, I promise. Use the comment section strategically. And, I just want to say that the stakes of this narrative war, and the media is a big part of that war, could not be higher, right? Hamas and its anti-Zionist allies across the world understand that Western media is a weapon. And if the world accepts the false story that Israel is an evil, genocidal apartheid state, then terrorism will prevail. And Jews everywhere will face danger. And the United States may not be a place where we'll want to be if that narrative prevails. Now, if the truth wins out, if a global majority understands that Israel is confronting evil, that it fought a 7-front war against that evil, that it's fighting Iran and Hamas and Hezbollah to destroy that evil and stop global chaos, the result would be a historic blow against terrorism and a real chance for peace for Israelis and Jews. And so which future emerges depends in no small part on which narrative succeeds in this global war on information. And I want to share with you one thing that I like, which is Natan Sharansky, who was the leader, was considered a leader of the Refusnik movement in Soviet Russia when Jews were being targeted and they didn't want to give in. They were refusing to give in to Soviet propaganda and to assimilate and to give up their Judaism. So they were called refuseniks. And Sharansky and all these refuseniks, with help from Americans and Jews from across the West, got out. Many of them were able to get out, go to Israel, go to America. And Sharansky talks about a concept of the conscious pariah. And I think I'm a conscious pariah, and I would encourage us all to be conscious pariahs. What does that mean? It means when you speak up for Israel, when you speak up for Jewish self-determination and tell the truth, what does that mean? It means you have to be brave, right? And we're very brave people. Jews are brave. We know that from history. We know that from our own lives. And then all we have to do really is hold tight to our moral values and speak from a place of moral values. And then we can't lose, right? Because even though the rest of the world socially might see us as pariahs, we're going to be conscious pariahs. We know that they're wrong when they demonize and distort and are bigots against Israel and against Jews. We have to hold true to our values and use them as our North Star. And if we just speak from a place of truth and of Jewish values and moral values, then that's all we need. We don't have to tap into some superpower. Just speak from the face of your values, that you know what they're saying is wrong, that it's racist, and speak the truth. And that just means standing by your values as your North Star. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that. And part of that is speaking out against this media war on Israel. And so I thank you all for being here today and listening to me. And anybody who wants to reach out to me, please do. You can find me on Instagram at Kevin Deutsch Journalist. You could find me on X at K Deutsch Journal. You can check out my website at kevindeutsch.us. And if you're on Substack or interested in Substack, I would ask you to subscribe for free or pay subscription to my Substack, which is called After October 7th, where I talk about all of these issues. And I thank you all for being here today. Thank you.
Hey, Kevin, do you have we got a few minutes here. Do you want to take a couple questions?
Oh yeah. I planned on taking questions. So I figured I'm ready. As long as you want to go, I can answer questions.
I don't know if we have a mic I can pass around, but I'll repeat the question so you can hear it. Is that okay?
Okay. Yes.
Thank you so much. My husband and I are former journalists, so we can relate to you a lot. Mike Huckabee is a good friend of ours. He's a good friend of Israel. He's interviewed on Newsmax a lot. We get good news from there. Can you tell us what media outlets are trustworthy with correct information?
Did you hear that?
Well,
okay, good. All right.
Yeah, I heard it. Yeah, thank
Good.
you.
Perfect.
That's a great question. And it's so interesting because before October 7th, would have never told you that Fox News tells the truth about Israel. I would have never. But like many Jews in America, my opinion of the news media changed, and I began to see what I'm talking about now. So I would say that when it comes to the truth about Israel, I like to read the Journal, Wall Street Journal. It's not always perfect, but I would say that it is largely fair to Israel. There are stories that I think where they do have bias, but for the most part, I trust them. I would also say Fox News. Now, even if you are a liberal Democrat and you want to throw out everything that Fox News says, don't throw out the Israel coverage, because I think they're actually pretty good on Israel. Now, they do have a correspondent on the ground in Israel who's been criticized for parroting Hamas propaganda. But I would say, for the most part, the organization does pretty well. I would also encourage, what I do mostly is read Israeli news sources. I read the Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post, and I also read the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS, or the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, JTA. And these are outlets that I find to be is fairer to Israel than at least the mainstream press. And of course, we know that the Israeli press could be extremely tough on Israel because no one is more critical of the Israeli government and Netanyahu than Israelis, right? And so the anti-Zionist movement, they think they're just criticizing Israelis, but no, Israelis know how to criticize Israelis without being racist. So I would encourage us to also go directly to the English language sources like the ones I named in Israel.
Thank you.
Go ahead. No, would you, thank you for addressing us today. Would you be kind enough to speak your thoughts about right-wing anti-Zionists like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and others like them?
Yeah, I think right-wing anti-Zionism is a huge concern. I think that Tucker Carlson, as we saw yesterday with his propaganda effort when he was at Ben Gurion Airport and said he'd been unjustly detained when he was just going through a regular security stop that we all go through when we visit Israel. But he or someone in his circle called the Daily Mail, I believe it was the Daily Mail, and that story immediately went viral. So he knew that a Western media outlet would essentially immediately demonize Israel and put that into the information stream. And that's what we're up against. So you have Tucker Carlson, you have Candace Owens, who is just, I try to distinguish between classic anti-Semitism and anti-Zionist bigotry, which I think is also its own distinct form of hate. It's been being studied as its own distinct ideology of hate toward Jews through the prism of Israel and Zionism. But she does both, and I think Carlson does both. I think they're both anti-Jewish bigots. And then, of course, you have people like Alex Jones. You have that Myron Gaines, he's another extremely dangerous guy. So this whole right-wing manosphere too is really dangerous. And there's a debate about whether or not you want to try to silence these people, right? But if you do, then they're going to go off into their own little independent world, which is what all these people I just named did. And they develop these massive niche audiences. So I don't know the best way to fight that. What I do know is that that right-wing, I believe it's being encouraged and propagated by the same interests that I discussed earlier, the Muslim Brotherhood, Qatar, people who back the ideology of destroying Israel, and through that ideology, destroying America and the West. And I think the right-wing anti-Zionism is a huge problem. And those of us who are a great example is Turning Point, right? Because I know a lot of people who are involved with Turning Point and college students. And even though the national organization has indulged anti-Zionism, right? They keep Tucker Carlson on their paid speaker roles. The college level, a lot of the college Jewish students feel comfortable at Turning Point, and they're speaking out against the anti-Zionism in the organization. So, and try to fight that in their individual chapters. So I think within Republican politics, people have to be brave. And I think we have seen that to some degree, but we need more bravery, a bravery that we're not seeing, unfortunately, in the mainstream Democratic Party, other than Richie Torres, John Fetterman, etc.
Well, thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Question. You've identified the Muslim Brotherhood as having a role in the region. My question is this. As you travel the country and visit with your colleagues, have you found out the ownership of the various medias, BBC, Reuters, USA Today, Guardian, and so on, and even the ownership of our local newspaper? And have you examined the fact that in June of 24, the FCC granted an exclusive license for radios to George Soros, 250 opportunities. So my question is this. In many areas, if you want to find out who is behind something, you follow the money. So have you and your colleagues checked out the ownership of these various media? And you may find out it's owned by Islamic interests. And that's the reason that on October 8th, all these media identified Hamas as militants. In the face of our State Department, in 1990 designated Hamas as terrorists. So is that something worthwhile for you to explore?
Thank you for your question. I absolutely think that we are seeing moneyed interest from the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't just come out and say, hey, we're the Muslim Brotherhood, we're going to fund anti-Israel media. I mean, they have all these corollary organizations throughout the West, including in the United States, many of them posing as legitimate Islamist advocacy groups. And there are a lot of legitimate Islamic, I should say, Islamic advocacy groups, but some of them are backed by the poisonous Islamist terroristic ideology that seeks to essentially erase any attempt by the mainstream Islamic world to make peace with Israel and Jews. The Islamists want to dominate Islam, of course. And so you see groups, you absolutely see, and I'll acknowledge this. When I was a journalist in mainstream newspapers, I used to say, well, this whole, the Soros Foundation stuff, it's all a bunch of bunk. but in reality, when you look at the money, the foundation, and I don't know how much they have to do with it, but the people making the decisions about where the money goes certainly are funding some extremely radical anti-Israel groups, which then have influence over media. And so you are seeing a huge attempt to dominate the media narrative through the Muslim Brotherhood money, through Qatar, through Turkish money, through Egyptian money, through Russian money, because also Russia and China, it behooves them to back this anti-Zionist narrative because it destabilizes. Anytime you can create Jews as an enemy, you could destabilize democracies, and that's what we're seeing. That attack on America right now, and Britain and France, it's an attempt to destabilize democracies through poisoning the well with Jew hatred. And there is a lot of money being spent to do that. And certainly BBC has fallen under that influence, unfortunately. And what's really interesting, and this is the last thing I'll say about this, but you've seen we have all these democratic safeguards in the West that are meant to stop things like this happening, from our media being poisoned by a racist ideology against Jews, from our governments being poisoned. But the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and this ideology that has a massive bankroll behind it, for its narrative media war on Israel and Jews, has created an environment where they can get around our safeguards, right? By funding specific politicians, by funding specific media organizations, by whitewashing information through NGOs, through local nonprofit groups, and they found a way to game our system. And so we have to fight back by acknowledging that that's going on. And I just want to clarify. I think that it's potentially we could get back to a place where we can have peace negotiations, where we can have a normal, stabilized reality again, instead of the distorted reality that this extremist narrative is creating globally. But that the narrative right now is poisoned against Zionists, Jews, and Israel, and that's because of the money that we're seeing expended. And we have to win this war of narrative so that we can ultimately succeed and be safe in these Western democracies.
Kevin, thank you so much on behalf of Iowans Supporting Israel. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Give a nice round of applause. Thanks.
Thank you.
And your thoughts. If your travels ever bring you to Des Moines, we hope you'll let us know you're here, and we'll try to arrange something for you. Just really enjoyed this a lot. Appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Just want to remind the group that we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We will always like lunch to be free so that we have a chance to have these free exchange of ideas. But that doesn't mean that our efforts are always free. So if you can ever help us out with a tax deductible donation, we always appreciate it because we'll continue to make an effort to make sure that we can spread Iowans Supporting Israel throughout the state. Then the really exciting thing is on March 19th at this location, we're going to have a speaker who's going to talk about what it's like to be an Israeli Christian. And his name is Shadi Kalu, and he's someone who has actually served in the IDF and has been involved in the Jewish government. And I think it should be a really interesting talk because I think maybe not everybody knows that Israel is not limited to just Jews. There's Christians there, there's Arabs, and this is just a really good take on what it's like to be somebody who may not be Jewish in Israel, but still loves the state of Israel. So we're looking forward to hearing from him as well. Thank you so much for coming today. Look forward to seeing you in a month, March 19th.